The forbidden tattoo in our village. There was a deeply rooted belief in the spiritual implications of tattoos. For instance, tattoos of dragons should not extend past the shoulders, and tigers should never descend below the waist. Certain tattoos, like those of Guan Yin with closed eyes or Guan Yu with open eyes, were considered to carry spiritual weight too immense for ordinary people to bear. My grandfather was a skilled tattoo artist, renowned for his mastery of ancient techniques. One day, a local thug, having gained some notoriety, forced my grandfather to tattoo an image of Guan Yu with closed eyes on his back. My grandfather refused, claiming that the man's destiny wasn't strong enough to carry such a tattoo. But the thug, unyielding, threatened to burn down my grandfather's shop and kidnap me if he didn't comply. My grandfather, reluctantly bowing to the threats, agreed to the thug's demands. The preparation for the tattoo was solemn, almost ritualistic. My grandfather lit incense and muttered prayers under his breath as he mixed the ink, a secret formula that had been passed down through generations. He warned the thug one last time, "This tattoo isn't just art. It's a bond between you and the spirit of Guan Yu. If you disrespect it, you may not live to regret it." The thug, cocky and dismissive, laughed. "I don't need your superstitions, old man. Just do it." It was the ghost festival when she walked into the shop. Her appearance was striking, not because of any unnatural beauty, but because of the haunted desperation etched into her face. She clutched her swollen belly protectively, her trembling hands betraying the fear she was trying to suppress. The air seemed heavier as she stepped inside, as if the unseen world had followed her in. She glanced around the dimly lit shop, her gaze settling on me. "Is the master here?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. I told her my grandfather was away, attending to something he had described as unfinished business. She bit her lip, her expression darkening. "I was told only he could help me." I hesitated, the weight of my grandfather's warning from years ago pressing on my mind. He had always spoken of the ghost festival as a time when the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead grew thin. I wasn't sure whether the woman before me belonged to one or the other. She lowered her head, as though trying to summon the strength to speak, and then began. "I am Chen Quan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm pregnant with my first child. But something is wrong. I've been feeling strange for months now, ever since an incident in my home." She paused, glancing around nervously as if expecting someone to eavesdrop. I motioned for her to continue, urging her with a soft nod. "About 3 months ago," she continued, "a snake slithered into my house. I was terrified, but I killed it with a stick. It was only after that, after I disposed of its body, that things started to change. I began to feel watched. A strange sensation, as if something was in my home, around me. I noticed marks on my skin. At first, they were small, like scratches. But then, they grew. They looked like the veins of a serpent, crawling across my skin, especially around my belly." She lifted her shirt, and I saw it, a twisting pattern of veins, dark and sinuous, creeping across her abdomen. It was as though something ancient and unnatural was taking root inside her, coiling beneath her skin like a serpent. The sight made my blood run cold. The marks weren't just veins, they had a life of their own, pulsating with an eerie, unnatural rhythm. Chen Quan's voice quivered as she spoke again. "I don't know how to explain it. After the snake, things just started to get worse. At night, I hear whispers, like voices from the walls, murmuring in a language I don't understand. Sometimes, I feel something, inside me, moving. I don't know if it's the child, or something else." She paused, her face pale with fear. "I'm terrified it's not just a child growing inside me. I think it's something else. Something evil." She lifted her shirt, and I saw it, a twisting pattern of veins, dark and sinuous, creeping across her abdomen. It was as though something ancient and unnatural was taking root inside her, coiling beneath her skin like a serpent. The sight made my blood run cold. The marks weren't just veins, they had a life of their own, pulsating with an eerie, unnatural rhythm. Chen Quan's voice quivered as she spoke again. I don't know how to explain it. After the snake, things just started to get worse. At night, I hear whispers, like voices from the walls, murmuring in a language I don't understand. Sometimes, I feel something, inside me, moving. I don't know if it's the child, or something else. She paused, her face pale with fear. I'm terrified it's not just a child growing inside me. I think it's something else. Something evil. I felt a shiver run through me. Her words echoed in my mind, something evil. My grandfather had often spoken of the dangerous spirits that lurked in the world, and the ancient powers that could be summoned if one wasn't careful. He'd warned me never to underestimate the weight of a spiritual request, especially one that involved a curse or a malevolent force. I looked into her eyes, those haunted, desperate eyes, and I knew I couldn't ignore her plea. This was no ordinary request. This was a call to something far darker than I had ever encountered. I was told you could help me, she whispered again, her voice barely audible. That your grandfather could save me, that the Kui Van could protect me. Her hand trembled as she placed it over her belly, as though shielding her child from an unseen threat. Please, I need your help. I don't know where else to turn. I felt a shiver run through me. Her words echoed in my mind, something evil. My grandfather had often spoken of the dangerous spirits that lurked in the world, and the ancient powers that could be summoned if one wasn't careful. He'd warned me never to underestimate the weight of a spiritual request, especially one that involved a curse or a malevolent force. I looked into her eyes, those haunted, desperate eyes, and I knew I couldn't ignore her plea. This was no ordinary request. This was a call to something far darker than I had ever encountered. I was told you could help me, she whispered again, her voice barely audible. That your grandfather could save me, that the Kui Van could protect me. Her hand trembled as she placed it over her belly, as though shielding her child from an unseen threat. Please, I need your help. I don't know where else to turn. As she spoke, I could feel the room grow colder, as if the very air itself was holding its breath. I knew that this tattoo would be unlike anything I had ever done before. The Kui Van was a powerful ritual, one that involved not just skill, but deep knowledge of the spirits and the forces that governed them. It was said to trap malevolent energies, but it also carried its own risks. If the tattoo was not done correctly, it could bind the spirit to the person forever. I excused myself to prepare, gathering the tools I would need, the special ink, the sacred oils, and the sealed container my grandfather had left behind for situations like this. As I opened the box, the scent of incense and herbs filled the air, a reminder of the ancient rituals that had been passed down through generations. The ink itself was a mix of rare ingredients, each one carefully chosen to bind the spirit within. When I returned to her, Chen Quan was sitting on the small cot in the back of the shop, her hands folded over her belly. She was pale, her face drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes burned with determination. She knew this was her last hope. I nodded at her, signaling her to lie down. The ritual was about to begin. As I prepared to start the tattoo, I could feel the air around us shift, as if something unseen was watching. The room was heavy with anticipation, and I knew that whatever force had been tormenting her was not far behind. I dipped the needle into the ink and began the delicate work, tracing the intricate lines of the Kui Van on her skin. The moment the needle made contact, a faint chill ran through the room, as if something had stirred. Chen Quan winced, but did not cry out, her resolve was unwavering. As I continued, I noticed something strange. The marks on her belly, those dark veins, seemed to pulse with a life of their own, reacting to the tattoo. The deeper I worked, the more they writhed, as if the tattoo itself was drawing out the malevolent energy that had taken root within her. The room grew colder still, and the whispers that had haunted her began to fill the space, a cacophony of voices that seemed to speak in tongues. I pushed forward, focusing all my energy on the tattoo. I had to finish it, or else, whatever was inside her would escape, and the consequences would be unimaginable. Finally, after what felt like hours, the last stroke was completed. I stepped back, breathing heavily, and looked at my work. The Qui Van, intricate and powerful, glowed faintly in the dim light. The air around us seemed to settle, and the whispers slowly faded into silence. Chen Quan looked down at her belly, and for the first time since she entered the shop, a look of relief washed over her face. The marks had stopped moving. The oppressive weight that had filled the room had lifted. She breathed deeply, as if awakening from a long nightmare. But I wasn't so sure it was over. The power of the Qui Van was unpredictable, and its effects could linger long after the ritual had been completed. "I don't know what will happen now," I said, my voice low. "But I hope this will protect you and your child." He shop felt oppressively silent after Chen Quan left, as though her departure had taken something tangible with it. Yet, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed darker, as if they were gathering. I could still hear faint whispers, not from Chen Quan, but from something else. It was a language I couldn't understand, a guttural resonance that made my skin crawl. I turned to clean my tools, needing something to steady my hands. But as I reached for the inkpot, I froze. The faint glow from the tattoo tools hadn't faded. The ink I had used, specially prepared for Qui Van rituals, still shimmered faintly, pulsing as if alive. A sudden chill swept through the room, and I instinctively looked to the door. It was open. I hadn't heard it creak, hadn't felt the rush of air as it swung inward. But there it was, ajar, revealing the night outside. The Ghost Festival was at its height, and the street beyond was eerily empty, save for the faint glow of lanterns swaying in the wind. My instincts screamed at me to stay put, but I couldn't. Something unseen was pulling me forward, compelling me to step outside. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The air grew dense, heavy with the scent of incense and something acrid, like burning flesh. The lanterns along the street flickered, their light distorted. I turned toward the direction Chen Quan had taken, and my blood ran cold. She was there, standing beneath a large banyan tree, frozen in place. Her back was to me, but her figure seemed wrong, her limbs slightly elongated, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Around her, the shadows seemed alive, twisting and writhing as though they were feeding off her presence. "Chen Quan!" I shouted, my voice breaking through the oppressive silence. She turned slowly, too slowly, and when her face came into view, I staggered back. Her eyes weren't her own, they were entirely black, like deep voids swallowing the faint light. Her mouth moved, but the voice that came out wasn't hers. It was deep, guttural, and spoke the same incomprehensible language I had heard in the whispers. The shadows around her surged, taking on forms, snakes, serpents, fanged beasts, each one more horrifying than the last. They coiled and snapped, their movements in sync with the pulsating glow of the Qui Van I had etched on her skin. It was then that I realized, the tattoo hadn't bound the malevolent force. It had only enraged it. I reached for the protective charm my grandfather had taught me to carry, a small jade talisman etched with ancient sigils. Holding it tightly, I began to chant, my voice trembling but steadying with each word. The shadows hissed and recoiled, their forms flickering like fire caught in a storm. But they didn't retreat entirely, they circled us, waiting. "Chen Quan, fight it!" I shouted, hoping some part of her could still hear me. For a brief moment, her eyes flickered, black voids giving way to terrified humanity. "Help me!" She screamed, her voice breaking through the unnatural language. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The malevolent force surged again, wrenching control away from her. The ground beneath the banyan tree began to crack, dark tendrils snaking upward from the earth as if the tree itself was awakening. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of spirits clamoring for release. My jade talisman trembled in my hand, the sigils glowing faintly, but it wasn't enough. I was outmatched, facing forces I hadn't been prepared to confront. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on my shoulder, firm but reassuring. I spun around, ready to defend myself, but it was my grandfather. His face was ashen, his expression grim. "You shouldn't have done this," he said, his voice heavy with both reproach and urgency. "But there's still time to set it right." He stepped forward, holding a small black box I had never seen before. With one swift motion, he opened it, releasing a burst of golden light. The tendrils recoiled violently, and the shadows screamed, a sound so piercing it made me cover my ears. My grandfather began chanting, his voice strong and commanding, weaving a spell I could barely comprehend. The golden light surged toward Chen Quan, enveloping her and the writhing shadows. For a moment, everything was chaos, light and dark clashing violently, the air vibrating with the force of their battle. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Chen Quan collapsed to the ground, unconscious but alive. The shadows were gone, the banyan tree silent once more. My grandfather stood over her, his breathing labored, the black box now sealed and glowing faintly. "She's safe, for now," he said, turning to me. His gaze was sharp, piercing. "But this isn't over. You've awakened something far older than either of us, and it won't rest until it's satisfied. You've taken your first step into a world you don't understand. Pray you're ready for what's to come." I looked down at Chen Quan, then back at my grandfather. The night had grown eerily quiet, but I knew he was right. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. As dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cracked doorway of the shop, casting long shadows over Chen Quan's still form. My grandfather sat beside her, his expression carved with exhaustion but unwavering resolve. The golden box lay beside him, pulsating faintly, as if it, too, was alive and weary. "She'll wake soon," he said, breaking the heavy silence. "But when she does, you must warn her. The entity may have retreated, but it will not stop. These things. They don't forget." I nodded, though my mind raced with questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. "What was it, grandfather? What have I done?" He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes shadowed by something far deeper than fatigue. "You have stepped into a realm where balance is fragile and debts are eternal. That tattoo, her plea for help, they've bound you to a contract you don't yet understand. And now, you must pay the price." Before I could respond, Chen Quan stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She gasped, sitting up abruptly, her hands instinctively clutching her belly. Her gaze darted to my grandfather, then to me. "It's gone," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I can feel it. The weight is gone." My grandfather nodded, but his tone remained grim. "Gone for now. But it will come back, stronger. You must prepare yourself. Both of you." As he spoke, a gust of wind swept through the shop, extinguishing the lanterns and rattling the golden box. The air turned cold, carrying with it the faintest echo of laughter, mocking, chilling, and familiar. My grandfather stood abruptly, his hand tightening on the box. "It knows," he muttered. "It knows you're not ready." Chen Quan looked at me, her face pale but determined. "What do we do now?" I hesitated, glancing at my grandfather. He gave me a hard look, then turned to the shelves, pulling out a weathered journal filled with faded ink and cryptic symbols. "You learn," he said, tossing it to me. "And you fight." The weight of the journal in my hands felt both grounding and overwhelming. As Chen Quan and I exchanged uncertain glances, I realized that my life, our lives, had irrevocably changed. The shadows had claimed us, and there was no escape. Only the hope of survival. But even as fear clawed at the edges of my resolve, I felt a flicker of something else, determination. I would face whatever came next, not only for Chen Quan but for myself. The shop, my craft, my lineage, it was no longer just my inheritance. It was my responsibility. As I looked out at the horizon, the faint glow of the sun obscured by lingering mist, I made a silent vow, to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or twisted it might be. For the night had ended, but the story was far from over. To be continued. Thank you for watching. The story has only just begun, and the next chapter will dive even deeper into the mysteries, with even more twists and intense moments. Don't miss out, stay tuned for the next video, where the stakes will rise and the excitement will only get greater.